Okay, well, I think I'll go ahead and get started. If people join later, we'll have this recorded for them and available through the website. But welcome everyone to part 2 of our grant webinar series. The first part, we had Amelia Carricker, a program officer, talking to us about different grant mechanisms. The focus of today's webinar is supplements, which is a broad umbrella, but we've assembled a panel of speakers who have a pretty broad range and depth of experience related to different kinds of supplements. I think at the end, we'll probably have a couple of announcements, including some deadlines for the network. But I'm going to go ahead and get the panel started. So the format is just that each of our panelists has prepared a few slides and some kind of general orienting and informative remarks for all of you. But you're welcome to ask questions that you can place in the chat, or you can wait until they're finished speaking and you can ask them directly. So just like in the prior webinar, we want to have a little more, you know, kind of face-to-face, virtual face-to-face interaction. But so for our panel today, we have Eileen Crimmins and Julie Zizmopoulos from the University of Southern California, and Patricia Jones from the NIA. And I'll just do more detailed introductions for each of them as they get their slides ready. So we'll start with Eileen Crimmins, and you can go ahead and start sharing your slide. So Eileen is the director of P30 Center and Demography of Aging Group, and also has submitted supplements under that center, but as well as other NIH funding mechanisms that she has.
So why can't I make this start? There. Okay, and this is very simple, and I'm really happy to be here today. I do not feel like I'm an expert in supplements to NIH grants, but partly that's because these are somewhat irregular, and you should know this is not something you're going to find a lot written about how to do. It's more something I've learned about by doing it, by watching other people, by seeing what's available, and partly by being on NIA Council. You sort of learn a lot about what can happen. So that's what can happen is supplements to NIH grants. So these are additions to existing grants. So that's the first thing. I'm going to be very simple. I'm not going to use technical terms, but I'm going to just say what it is in words that everybody can understand. So you can't start without a grant. You have to have a grant that exists, and you have to have a grant that has a set of specific aims. And those specific aims really do define the area that can be included in a supplement. So you can't have supplements that don't link relatively closely to an existing grant. And then the next thing is you have to have a willing and able principal investigator of the original grant. Now, if it's yours, that's easy enough. But if you need to involve someone else, that principal investigator needs to be part of the planning of any supplement grant, because the principal investigator needs to be convinced that adding the supplement will add to the work findings and the research productivity of the overall grant, and that he or she needs to believe that it's worth the work that will be involved for the principal investigator to actually get the grant. So if I submit a supplement, even though it's been written by somebody else because it's their interest, I need to be the one that actually submits it, and I need to be the one who basically outlines how this supplement interacts with the current specific aims of the grants. Now, there are two kinds of supplements. Administrative, which are really substantive topics, and diversity and re-entry to the workforce. And Patricia's going to talk about diversity and re-entry to the workforce. And administrative supplements are something you really have to have interaction with the agency with to understand if they are potentially available for a given topic and a given grant. So in recent years, supplements have been available for topics, quite specifically for AD and ADRD, and in the last year for COVID. And sometimes supplements have been available for specific kinds of grants. For instance, there have been AD supplements available for grants that did not originally have AD aims. So that's another little twist on things. So if your grant was originally coded an AD grant, which may have enabled you to get funding to begin with, you were not eligible for supplements that people who did not have an AD coded grant were eligible for. So you need to know these kinds of ins and outs of how NIH really does things. The other thing you need to know is what mechanisms allow what kinds of supplements. So administrative supplements or diversity supplements, when they're being awarded, sometimes they allow certain kinds of mechanisms and other times they don't. So you need to know this NIH language of R01, R24, T32, P30. I noticed that one of the current administrative supplement notices that's out there does not really allow P30. And I am somebody who has regularly used P30, which is centers, to actually get supplements. And right now, that one does not allow P30, but it does allow R24. This network is R24. And it does allow R01, which is sort of individual specific research grants, and specific announcements allow T32, which is institutional training. So you need to know about the aims of a grant. You need to know whether the PI is willing to actually do a grant, and you need to know what kind of opportunities are out there and what mechanisms they are linked to. So for instance, I had a P30, I had a T32, I had an R24, and I have several R01s. I can do supplements on almost any of those. But many people if certain kinds of mechanisms are better for certain kinds of supplements. You need to be clear if you ask for a supplement on a training grant, which is a T32, if you put somebody on with extra money, you need to use your original money the next year. Sometimes PIs might not even know that. But I would say my most important recommendation for anybody who's interested in a supplement is to talk to the potential project officer. These are not regular grants that go to regular study sections. These are grants that are internally handled, generally almost always internally handled, unless they're extraordinarily large, they go to council. But that means the project officer presents the grant at an internal funding meeting. That means the project officer has to be very committed to encouraging the funding of the grant. If the project officer is not particularly interested, the grant is much less likely to get funded. And so I have submitted grants that have been funded, and I have submitted grants that have not been funded. And I would say the ones that have not been funded, I've done for people who were interested in submitting, but the project officer either wasn't interested in the topic particularly, didn't think it was a hot topic that would be contributing to science enough, or the person who got recommendations from the project officer did not pay enough attention to those recommendations in submitting the grant. So this is very different from other kinds of grants that go to study sections where project officers have basically little input on what happens in review. This is a place where project officers have a lot of input. So I don't think you can talk a project officer into a grant. That is not a good idea, but I think you can talk with the project officer and frame a grant in a better way so it works better for you and you can help develop the arguments that a project officer might use. So that's those are my main points, and I'll react later after other people have talked, I guess.
Great, thank you, Eileen. And as I said, we're just going to keep questions till the end because I think that our panelists, although they did not work in coordination with each other, have put together a really well coordinated set of presentations for you. So our next presenter is Dr. Patricia Jones from the NIA. She's the director of the Office of Special Populations, and she'll tell you a little bit more about what that means, but she basically leads all of the efforts aimed at augmenting or stimulating health disparities research at NIA. So that means both the research itself, but also diversifying the biomedical workforce. So she's going to be talking to us about two kinds of diversity supplements, one that people may be more aware of, and the reentry supplement, which I think most people are not aware of in part because it's a bit newer. And I think there generally are a lot of questions about the reentry supplement. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I am so very pleased to join you this afternoon. It's afternoon for us here on the East Coast, probably mid-morning for you back in Los Angeles. I was sharing with your host for today's event that I'm always particularly thrilled when I have an opportunity to address scholars and faculty at the University of Southern California, because I grew up about 1.5 miles from University Park. So it's home, and I'm always thrilled to see when the institution is continuing to move forward and make opportunities available to a broad swath of students and researchers and faculty. So to that point, I want to acknowledge my colleague is on the line, Dr. Todd Hine. He is the chief of the Office of Small Business Research. I realize that both of our names are showing up as Patricia Jones, but I'm Patricia Jones and he's Dr. Todd Hine. So wave your hand, Todd, so they know who you are. And he is joining because he has particular expertise around awards that are received and accepted related to small business research and technical opportunities. So hopefully there'll be individuals with some interest in that area as well. So I will move forward. As Jennifer mentioned, I understand my colleague in the Division of Behavioral and Social Research, Dr. Amelia Carricker, has already addressed a more detailed presentation some time ago on other mechanisms that our institute makes available. So today I'm just going to focus specifically on diversity and reentry administrative supplements as two particular pathways for growing the biomedical workforce. But I just want to acknowledge that there are definitely opportunities, both general and AD specific Alzheimer's disease and other related dementia disease specific opportunities. And here are some URLs that you can reference and take a little time to visit at our website for more information. And if you, for whatever reason, don't recall or weren't able to attend Dr. Carricker's presentation, I'm sure she covered a variety of mechanisms. This is pretty much the landscape of what the National Institute on Aging supports by career stage. And as I referenced, I'll just be focusing on the latter two with the red box around it. In terms of diversity and reentry administrative supplements, as Eileen mentioned, they are just that. The activity code is a supplement to a parent. They are administratively reviewed, and they follow a very broad swath of individuals in their career space. There may be individuals at the high school level or further out into their career as pre-docs or as postdocs interested in pursuing opportunities in partnership with a more senior researcher. And the mechanism does allow for introducing individuals at varying stages of their career into the biomedical workspace. The parent grant has to have at least 2 years left on the award, and you cannot have had prior public health service funding, basically a grant prior to this application coming in. How this is different from the reentry supplement is that this is really a set of funds available for individuals whom, for whatever reason in their personal life journey, had to take time away from their traditional path due to health or some other familial obligation, and they're trying to re-enter into the workforce and regain their footing as a scholar and a researcher. The re-entry resources are a really good pathway for that purpose. I just want to mention, even though this is not funding, there is an opportunity available for persons who are early in their career as scientists, irrespective of the phase of research that you may focus on. But if you have an academic appointment and you're early in your career, there is the Butler-Williams Scholars Program. Again, there's no money attached to it, but this is a very prestigious training opportunity. Many people apply 3, sometimes 4 times before they're accepted into the program, but once they've been accepted, the opportunities to grow your professional network are really tremendous. And scholars, researchers who establish themselves in aging research recognize Butler-Williams as a true opportunity to move forward. This year, as we did last year, it will be convened virtually, and it will be convened over a 3-day period. The application process is open right now through March 31. So we certainly encourage everyone who is eligible as an early career investigator with an academic appointment to consider this opportunity. And yes, it is definitely open in terms of promoting by race, ethnicity, and gender, diversifying the workforce and other characteristics. I should mention, part of what makes Butler-Williams particularly unique is that as with many of our funding opportunities within NIA, there may be shared interests with other ICs that an investigator may consider as far as a research topic. And many of our scholars do scaffold their career from Butler-Williams onto applying to awards offered through other institutes, centers, or offices. And so these are just some of the examples of different parts of NIH. Our graduates or alum have moved on to submit for various mechanisms and awards. So again, if you have any interest in exploring aging research or aging research with an additional component or question, this training opportunity may open up some resources for you. And just to say, as I mentioned, there are lots of other training resources. I want to bring your eye to this URL specifically for new and early stage investigators, and also the URL specifically for grants. We do have some examples of effective, well-written applications posted and other resources. If you choose to pursue different types of mechanisms aside from administrative supplements, they do have a pay line that's associated with them. That information is also on our website. So I just encourage everyone to take a moment and review the details. And I will stop there with a quote from Dr. Marian Wright Edelman. We definitely at NIA wholeheartedly support scholars and investigators who want to grow and expand their skill set. And this is my personal mantra for me. Education is for improving the lives of others and for leaving your community and the world better than you found it. And that's what we hope and aim to do. It's what I hope to aim to do. Thank you.
Jennifer, we can't hear you.
Thank you so much for that. I was just saying that when we post the video on our YouTube page, we try to put all of the web links below so that you have access to all of the embedded material. So our final panelist is Julie Zizimopoulos. She's a co-director of the USC Alzheimer's Disease RICMAR, which is another P30 mechanism. And she's a director of one of the new demography of aging centers. So as Eileen pointed out, the P30s are kind of powerhouse, like sort of workhorses for supplements. So Julie has experience with supplements and is someone who you could talk to, I suppose, in the future about supplements.
Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to Eileen and Patricia. it's kind of a benefit to go third because my colleagues were able to provide a lot of the really key information. So what I thought I would do is just spend a couple of minutes, maybe 5, going through 2 different types of examples of supplements, and then making a few comments about, some of the challenges that I face going through different types of supplements. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I want to first just talk about what I put together as a checklist when I'm thinking about a supplement, or as I'll talk about in a minute, when I'm proposing to, let's say, a junior scholar to consider a supplement. And so this checklist just starts with how is this proposed supplement within the scope of the parent grant. And Eileen spoke a bit about this, and in the examples, I'll be a little bit more specific about thinking about how you might match what you're doing with the parent grant. My second sort of question that I pose to myself or to whoever I'm thinking about sort of supporting in the supplement is how does it advance the research area of that parent grant? And then also it's very helpful to think about if it supports an NIA research interest area. And Eileen talked about this, and it's very important that it's something that whatever institution you're sending to is excited about. It's on their list of topics that really need some scientific advance to them. Of course, you always want to think about whether your approach is rigorous, and then what is the output? What are you going to get out of this supplement? Is it going to be a paper? Is it going to be sort of a researcher public good? So this is kind of my internal checklist. And once I have an idea around each one of these, then I usually reach out to the project officer. So I have some things concrete to discuss with the project officer around each of these points. So I'm going to move on to one of the examples. So this example of a supplement is given in this first study goal, and it was to analyze different case definitions for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias across different types of ways of defining a person with disease. So we have self-reports, we have cognitive assessments, we have diagnoses, we have expert panel. And the type of supplement this was an administrative supplement to a P30. So this was our Roybal Center at USC. So I was able to kind of easily tie this case definition to one of the goals of the Roybal Center. So the Roybal Center Health Policy Simulation supports a dynamic microsimulation model. And one of the new models was models of prevalent dementia in the US. And so thinking about if you're going to model prevalent dementia in the US, you really need to understand how well are you identifying people with dementia. So the study goals of this fit very well into the goals of the P30 grant. And it supported at the time one of NIA's research areas, which was is given here, harmonizing outcomes in existing cohorts to enhance the study of risk and protective factors for AD-ADRD. So the approach for this was kind of a standard analytical research study. So the approach was very well described. And in this case, we actually included some preliminary data looking at how at one point in time, some of these different ways of defining it matched. And you don't always need to have preliminary data, but as in most grants, if you have something to suggest, wow, this could be really important, it's great to be able to include it. We had a very specific output and timeline, 2 publications over 1 year. And we needed this supplement on top of the current grant because we had not budgeted in the current grant for this particular project, the labor and getting some of the data, which had an additional cost. So we could be very specific about all of these points in the supplement proposal. So this was I would say, more of a standard research project. And I wanted to, as a second example, talk about a different kind of supplement. And this one was a supplement that proposed a meeting. And the meeting, the goal of the meeting was to bring different stakeholders from both research and practice to investigate the feasibility of a national AD-ADRD registry. So really thinking about, do we need it? What do we have? What could a registry do for research? And this, kind of in contrast to the first example, which was something my colleagues and I really wanted to do. We had this research idea. This one was really kind of a joint discussion with the program officer. So it started from there. Like, is this something that is important, of interest? So this was a really kind of a conversation from the very, very beginning. It was another administrative supplement, but this one was to a R01 grant. So I had, and in this case, this was a grant that I am PI on. And it was a grant to look at racial disparities and risk of Alzheimer's disease. And so the way that we were thinking about the registry in relation to this grant and why it was a fit is because in thinking about disparities, racial and ethnic disparities in Alzheimer's disease, both risk and care, we have limited data sources. So the goal was to think about, is a registry another important source for understanding care and outcomes in underrepresented populations, underrepresented in the sense that they're often underrepresented in clinical trials and other survey data sources. So again, we looked to see what kind of research area that the National Institutes of Health, or Aging in particular here, were interested in, and it fit well within that. So the approach, because this was a meeting supplement, defined very specifically what the meeting's goals were and who we thought would be a potential participant list, with the idea that the participant list would be, kind of a conversation to make sure we had all the relevant key stakeholders involved. We proposed that the output would be a paper summarizing the meeting's findings, and then we had what was not in my original grant was obviously the cost to organize two meetings. So the participant travel, organizing the meeting. So those are two examples. I did want to make one other comment before I kind of wrap this up and we turn into more discussion. In these examples, we had sort of researcher initiated grants, myself and some colleagues. We had something that was really a conversation between NIA and a group of researchers interested in this area. And another supplement that I can talk about in more detail later. It was, I actually went to a junior scholar who was new in the faculty and suggested that they think about a supplement to my grant, because they were working in a related area. And it's hard for a junior scholar to get their first grant. And so a supplement is a way in which they can get some preliminary data before going on to getting their own grant. So I brought the idea of a supplement to a junior scholar. That's not always how it works, but sometimes if you have P30s and you have R01s, it's a great way to kind of help support careers. I also wanted to mention that there's another type of supplement that I have pursued in the past and is possible, which is training or educational workshops. So we have one coming up, which is the Science of ADRD for Social Scientists. So it's just a training and educational workshop. So I'm going to pause there because I'm sure we can answer questions and field questions now. And I will open it or move it back to Jennifer to lead us on.
Well, thank you again. As I said, it's almost as if the three of you coordinated with each other, because I think that these presentations flowed really nicely. I just want to add one thing that I found out over the summer in speaking with the program officer about supplements, which is that just as the ADRD allocation at NIA is larger, that also applies to supplements. So part of what Julie and Eileen were mentioning in terms of making sure you have good programmatic fit and you have buy-in from program, I think success also is probably a little bit higher if you're going to be funded through the ADRD budget. So, but I think, yeah, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. As I said, you can write a question in the chat, but if you want to also just ask people directly, it would be great to have some interaction among our network members and these panelists. I see Bob Hummer has his hand up.
Yeah, so thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for Patricia and Todd and Eileen and Julie. This is wonderful. So I had one question maybe that it could apply to all four of you really. And so as I think about these supplements, and it's clear that the discussion between the applicant and the program officer is really, really critical. But so many of these supplements are bringing on a new investigator. And so I'm wondering, in your experience, Julie and Eileen, and then from the side of Patricia and Todd as well, who does that conversation involve? Is it the PI, just herself or himself, or is the initial discussion, does that also include the new person or new people you're thinking about bringing along so they can kind of talk through their part of what this supplement would involve? And then how much writing do you send ahead of time? Do you send a proposed aims page for that supplement? And what is the PO looking for in terms of that contact? Thank you.
I can start. It varies. And it depends in some ways on what it is you're aiming for. I mean, diversity supplements, pretty much I would deal with the program officer myself and say, this is my candidate and this is what he or she looks like and this is what he or she wants to do. Sometimes, like Julie, there are strange things. So for instance, one of our network, your network now, when we met in Denver, John Haga suggested to one of the participants that a supplement on this might be a good idea. In that room, he turned to me, the participant, and said, how about can you sponsor a supplement on this topic? Well, John and the person had a conversation right then and there, and then we just wrote it up. So it honestly, it really depends on the people, their qualifications, and what the content is. I don't think there's a rule of thumb.
My perspective is a little different in that prior to joining NIA as the Director for Office of Special Populations, I was a program officer at a couple of different parts of NIH, and then prior to that at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And with supplements, typically the conversation is had with the PI of the parent award, because the real conversation that you're having is oftentimes around the parameters of the scientific fit and the budget. And they're responsible for being the shepherd of that award made to the institution. That's whose name will be on that grant, along with the other designated individuals from that institution. There has been one or two instances from a scientific perspective. I think Dr. Hummer, you asked what type of information has been written and submitted. Typically, it doesn't go beyond a one-page specific aims. We can't help you write your grant, so we try not to get into the details of things that are being proposed, but generally a specific aims page is sufficient to have a conversation around the fit with the scientific goals and objectives, whether or not it aligns with the institution's current priorities, how that new investigator coming on might strengthen or fortify what they're proposing to do. So usually you can have a pretty detailed conversation just with that one page without getting too far into the weeds. There has been an instance where I've spoken with the person applying because they really understood the science that they were proposing and could go back and revise some of the details in a more meaningful way. But typically that conversation is had with the PI of the parent award. Todd, do you have other points?
Sure. So, and also to link this question to the question in the chat, and it's very much what Patricia was just getting at, which is the supplement goes to the parent application. So let's say whoever applied and got awarded the award. That being said, the supplement, when merited, can cover anything in that parent grant. So it can cover additional funds for multi-PI or, more money to a subcontract. So all of that can be included in the supplement, but the supplement's actually applied for and going to the same person that the award goes to. And, linking back to your question, I think, the program office is definitely the right way to start. Right place to start. You will find sometimes if it's questions on like the mechanism, like around diversity supplements, the program officer may sometimes encourage you to also reach out to our office, the training office, and sometimes Patricia's office for specific questions around, policies relating to diversity supplements or things like that, where the individual PO may not be as familiar. But definitely the first step is to work with your PO, and they will be able to refer you for additional help if needed.
I just wanted to touch on one thing that I think, Bob, you were trying to get us to touch on, which is the linking with the junior scholars. And Eileen's example was really interesting because I think it's fairly unique. But I want to return to that in a minute. Typically, the way that junior scholars have been involved in supplements that are on one of my grants or centers has been in the ways I described. Either I have a research idea and I bring in a junior scholar who I think could benefit from learning about NIH grants and get some funding, et cetera. And the other case that I mentioned, I approached someone who was doing different work, but I thought could be a really great complement and push some of the research that I was doing forward, and her expertise was quite different. So I was able to kind of identify someone who I thought would be great to bring on the grant. But I imagine that in this webinar, there are many young, junior scholars who might be at institutions that don't have a P30, or maybe they don't necessarily have a link to an R01 that's ongoing at their institutions, but maybe they, are looking at someone's research and say, oh, so-and-so has a P30 at this, and my research fits in really well with that. I'm wondering whether, and maybe Eileen, you might have the best answer to this, whether you've had an experience of someone you haven't worked with approaching you with an idea that fits with the parent grant, and how that might work if it does work. Because as I think Patricia and Todd have brought up, ultimately the PI is responsible for shepherding it through and the science and what happens. So having a relationship is with the person proposing the supplement is somewhat important, or quite important. So I don't know, Eileen, if you have an experience outside of.
I would say my two unsuccessful supplement applications were people who were less closely connected to me, but desperately wanted to submit a supplement. And it was they were more or less marginally connected to the contents of our center. And they primarily, because the area of content was not particularly my area, they dealt with the program officers, and they were ultimately unsuccessful, actually. So, I mean, I have other successful and unsuccessful ones. I think the program office, the principal investigator of the grant really has to be able to sell it. And I also have learned that submitting probably more than one at a time may be a bit of overkill.
To answer part of your question, I think Eileen alluded to this in her opening comments. Yes, absolutely, starting that conversation between the PI of the parent and the program official for insight and guidance. But as was mentioned earlier, within the National Institute on Aging, and I say this because there are 27 parts to NIH, so every IC approaches this differently, and sometimes PIs have the notion that this was my experience with cancer or with DDK or some other institute, therefore it probably might be the same experience or process adopted in aging, and that may not necessarily be true. But within our particular institute, in addition to the program officer being involved with the initial review of details, there's a committee, a separate independent committee with individuals who represent that particular division from the scientific perspective. So there's actually 3 layers, if you will, that are looking at and assessing the relevance and the scientific rigor and the fit with the purpose of an administrative supplement to promote either diversity or to promote reentry into the workforce, either one. And so, you know, to the extent that does that individual have a meaningful relationship with the PI, it absolutely helps if the PIs and the applicants have an opportunity to build a rapport, not just from a scientific perspective, but from the application. I mean, sometimes it's pretty clear when you're not able to make the case that you know this individual and that this individual is able to really take the details and opportunities your center or your grant or your lab are making available to them and really scaffold into a successful career because you just don't know them. So it's really to everyone's benefit if you have a moment to build a rapport before you put that application in, because you're able to tell a more compelling story.
Okay, thank you for all of that. I guess I'm going to ask Lauren Gadosh actually if we answered her question, but I also wanted to clarify. I wonder if there's some confusion that the PI has to submit the proposal, be in conversation with the program officer and do all of the required reporting, but the supplement itself can go to any person at any university. So I also was a recipient of John Hage's matchmaking at the meeting Eileen spoke about, and I had an administrative supplement with Jennifer Montez's R01 grant at Syracuse. And the work from that grant then led to some preliminary data that network member Katrina Walsman and I used to submit an R01 proposal that she got funded. So I think John Hage's, like the invisible or not invisible hand of John Hage worked out really well. And I know Eileen had supplements that also had really good outcomes. So they can be program officer initiated or program initiated or PI initiated. So hopefully that answered Lauren's question.
I think it did mostly. I guess I was curious if you are an MPI on the grant, which PI has to apply? Like, can it be any of the multiple PIs? No.
So in our case,
it has to be the first one.
Right.
Okay.
So in our case, we're an MPI, and fortunately or unfortunately, that means that Jennifer Montez does all of the work.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Even if it goes to one of the rest of us, right? She's the one that's got to do all of the work.
Thanks, Jennifer.
And then, so we have some questions in the chat about eligibility. And Patricia, maybe you can speak to this more, or Todd, but the eligibility requirements are different for diversity versus reentry supplements. And then Lauren Gadosh also had a question about if you're not sure about eligibility of a candidate, should you clear it with the program officer? Sounds like you're all saying yes. Always talk to the program officer.
You know, it's a lot of work to put an application together. If you have any question in your mind about eligibility, budget, cost, time left, all of those logistical things that could slow down or thwart your efforts, you definitely want to have answers before you send it through your Office of Sponsored Research, because it wouldn't be time well spent.
Yeah, one thing to note about eligibility for the diversity supplements is we actually rely on the certification of the institution. So it's really not, we don't view it so much as our job to decide if the person is eligible and counts as underrepresented, as much as the university's job to make that determination and state that determination. And to kind of make this point a little more detailed, there have been instances where some university systems will count certain individuals as underrepresented that maybe we, very specific things where we might not have thought of or had it, but we would defer to that university. So I have seen this come up in our diversity supplement committee before. So, that's really in terms of certifying is an underrepresented, that's part of the chain.
Could I ask a clarifying question to all of you? And then we'll get to Sarah, who I just saw had a hand pop up. It's my understanding that the administrative supplements, like the ones Julie was describing, typically last for 1 year, but that diversity supplements are not really 1 year, they're 2-year supplements, that there's some difference in timeframes of the two mechanisms for supplements.
No, I think, I've seen multi-year supplements on both administrative and diversity. Obviously the most important thing is that the supplement has to be contained within the project period. So if the project period only has a year left, then the supplement can only have a year left. We don't at NIA fund supplements into no-cost extensions. So, they have to fit within the parent project period prior to any no-cost extension. But I have seen multi-year, both administrative and diversity supplements.
Great, thank you. Sarah?
So my question goes back to the point that was just raised about who actually determines eligibility on the dimension of if somebody can be classified as underrepresented or not. And I live in a state called Michigan where we have certain propositions to get back to our major theme of state differences and regional differences, where we have a lot of restrictions on how we can recruit, and on the basis of things like race, ethnicity, we have to do some gymnastics to make sure that we're recruiting for diversity and excellence, but also not breaking the state law. So what I'm wondering is, do we need to make a pitch in the materials of the supplement proposal to say, here's why we think this person is eligible? Or is that a conversation that we have with a program officer to kind of clear the person? It seems like if it's going to go to a committee, there needs to be some documentation that would fit within whatever local legal boundaries we might face. I just wanted to understand how you all on the program officer side or the institute side use evidence to determine eligibility.
So there is a letter included in the diversity supplement application from the institution. So we look first for that letter to state the eligibility. So that letter can state, they can either refer to the institution's own guidelines of what counts as underrepresented, but they can also refer to the funding opportunities guidelines. So they can say per the funding opportunity and,
right.
NIA policy that, a Latino woman would qualify as underrepresented. I'm just throwing things out. This candidate fits that background, and they are a U.S. citizen of this background, and they fit the eligibility. So that's what we would look for generally. Patricia, anything to add there?
I would agree. It's a little less about your state and local context, but more about to the extent you're able to tell a compelling story that fits with the funding opportunity announcement itself. And that's where reading the FOA becomes super critical. And, again, going back to the point we were speaking on earlier about rapport with that scholar that you're supporting, to the extent that you know their background and what makes their contribution, their particular science that they're bringing to your project really worth the effort to continue to shepherd their career, you can say something more compelling about how their background helps to diversify the workforce. So that letter is sufficient as documentation.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. Did anyone want to ask our panelists a question directly?
I'll ask a question on a different feature of supplements. And this has to do with just the format. So I've submitted a couple of supplements to my R01, and both of those supplements, for whatever reason, were 6 pages. I don't know why that happened. But I've also been told that internally NIA prefers even shorter than that because, you know, you're doing all the reviews internally. So maybe even 2 pages would be preferable. So I mean, is there in fact some guidance on how long a supplement should be and just the page requirements?
So when you talk about page requirements based on what the numbers you quoted, I'm assuming you're referring to just the research strategy. Because in reality, I
That's
mean,
right.
when we say supplements, they're 40-something pages or more. Once you add in, you know, all the budget pages and the bio sketches and letters and everything else. So I think the 6-page, I don't know if it might be written in the FOA, the 6-page limit. It's generally the standard. Patricia, did you have something
Yeah,
to say there?
actually, for the supplement 20-222, which is the diversity, it points you back to under section 4, part 2, it will point you back to the parent. It doesn't spell out the page number for the supplement itself. It'll tell you go back to the table of all the other parents that are eligible. And based on that language, then you craft the page limit for what you're turning in.
So the parent essentially sets the max.
Yeah,
You're kind of
in that
asking
way.
about the minimum, Jennifer. And I think 6 pages is kind of what people do because they almost do it more like an R03 or something like that without as much detail. But if I would never do 2 pages, frankly.
Well, and the number comes from that parent for this particular
Exactly.
announcement.
So what most of the cases, you've got a 12-page max or something, but you could have more depending on the parent.
Yeah. So it's not about our preference.
Yeah, I think, you know, just to kind of reiterate something that's been touched on already, but to make the point home, it also depends. So like I said, you're asking about the page limit for the research strategy, but how much time and pages you want, as long as it falls within the max, really depends on the supplement opportunity and what we're looking for. So for an administrative supplement, as an example, the research strategy becomes critical and you want to devote most of the space there because what we're looking for is how important is this additional activity to the overall success of the project, and that is your research strategy. For diversity supplement, on the other hand, that's still important and you should definitely have a couple of pages, whether, you know, let's say it's up to 12 or whatever it is, but doesn't have to be that long, about how it affects the parent. But the other thing that's just as, if not more important for the diversity supplement is the candidate and how is this going to help the candidate's career and things like that. So in that case, you want to spend just as much time on and space on your training plan and your career development plan, the mentoring plan. So that's where you'll be. So think about in terms of kind of how you build that package. How much you devote to each section will depend on what type of supplement it is and, you know, what we're reviewing.
Julie?
Great deal.
I was wondering if I could ask a question myself. So the question is around the range of the budget. And across my supplements, it's always been kind of a fuzzy unknown what the budget range is. And it usually ends up in conversation with the program officer where that budget lands. But I'm very interested to hear from Patricia and Todd about their feedback on that. And then Eileen, if you have any experience comments that you want to add.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So first, it really does vary based on the type of supplement opportunity. So especially when it comes down to like diversity and the reentry supplements, not only does it matter the funding opportunity, but for those FOAs, they have very strict guidelines on the amount of money per the level of the candidate and how much you can spend on supplies and how much you can spend on tuition. And so there are a lot of rules within those FOAs about, very specific budgetary items. I think the administrative supplement FOAs tend to be more, loose in terms of the overall, the number of restrictions on each of these categories. Generally, for administrative supplements, which can and often are larger, there's the $250,000 direct cost limit is the limit that can be approved by staff at the NIA. So anything above that limit is possible, but it goes through several other layers of review, including counsel, which Eileen can speak to herself. But so I would say for administrative supplements, the majority do fall within that $250,000 limit that we can do with staff review.
And I would just add, I know we've often referenced having conversations with the program officer, but the budget is actually an area where you really would want to lean on your Office of Sponsored Research and grants management staff who have expertise, not just with NIA grants, but they've seen more broadly other types of mechanisms and can leverage their knowledge on what's allowed and what's not allowed across NIH more broadly, and can help save time in what you're putting together or proposing before it even leaves your institution on its way to NIA, which is great because you want to shorten that loop of turning around with questions and rejections and all of that. So I strongly encourage everyone to, if you don't have a strong relationship with your Office of Sponsored Research grants management person, to tap into that resource as well, because they certainly have seen a broad swath of mechanisms and know all the legalese around what's allowed and all of that. And to Todd's point, it does depend on whether or not your scholar that you're supporting is a pre-doc versus a postdoc, and what tuition and all of that would even be requested, and equipment levels, and what's the definition of an equipment and things of that nature. And your sponsored research person can help you with that.
Julie, I would say from experience that the behavioral and social group at NIA does not like to bring things to council, period. And so they really do not like to go over 250. It kind of is a nuisance for them, and they, maybe in extreme circumstances they will do this, but they generally don't want to. The other thing was, there are sometimes like things seem like the Wild West. So some of the COVID announcements this year actually had extraordinarily high amounts for supplements. And I don't know if those got funded through BSR grants, but some of them were very high and not normal. So this was a not normal period. The other thing I've noticed is our BSR people aren't that fond of people putting in lots of stuff. Like, they're not all that fond of big equipment or equipment. So I'm not saying it's a rule or it's not a rule. I'm just saying there are ways in which BSR has ways of acting, which are going to influence how much support program officers are going to give. And part of it, as you know, in the social sciences, there are norms for behavior. And I think BSR people are better at obeying norms than some people in other parts of NIA. That's all I'll say about this.
Well, and I'll just, reiterate, as a behavioral social scientist myself, a strong suit of our background is to partner and collaborate broadly. And you're fortunate to have other RICMARs around you. And, there may be other opportunities with resources and investigators that can collaborate on an important question that may open up other divisions and different perspectives. So I would not limit yourself in the aging research space to where your skill can be leveraged. I'm sure you would bring great value to anyone who's willing to partner and collaborate.
I saw a hand up from Alexis. I'm not sure if your question is the same one that you put in the chat.
Yes.
So he wanted to know if there was a limit on the number of supplements. Was that your question?
Yeah, so for some reason, I once reached out to somebody who I thought, who had a grant that fell within my interest, and I asked whether they were open to a supplement, and I think the answer was something in the area of, I already have 2 and that's the limit. And I'm like, I don't know if there's a limit to how many can go into a grant, or if it was just a way of telling me, no, not this time. And just as a prospective mentor for minority students, I'm interested if I get a grant, if I end up writing one, if there's a limit for these sort of instruments to be attached to grants.
This sounds like maybe it's a question for our NIA reps to answer, although
Yes.
it might be, as Eileen pointed out, that some people, you can only go back to that trough so many times, I guess is what she was saying. But I'd be
Yes.
interested to see what Todd or Patricia have to say about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'd have to go through the documents. I'm not sure that there's any sort of, official legal limit. If there is, I'm not aware of it. It's very possible there is. I think that some of this is more guidelines and, also fairness. I mean, we have overall limits on the number of supplements and the amount of money we can fund with supplements each year. So, we do think about, and part of our review is, how much supplements has one group gotten? Is it fair to give you a 3rd supplement when there's another PI that hasn't had any and could use the additional help? So, I think, again, I don't know that there's any set rule. I have heard that too is kind of a guide. Generally, of course, when there's general guide, there's always exceptions to that guide, but this is all really for, in my opinion, fairness reasons, to try to spread things out so everybody has an opportunity.
Thank you, Todd.
So I'll offer a slightly additional perspective. I too have not heard of a hard, fast legal cutoff of any number, but you kind of want to keep in mind that part of the nature and benefit of a supplement is that you are collaborating with a more senior investigator who's going to put some time into helping you cultivate and develop your skill and your expertise around a particular question of interest. And that person needs to be realistic about how much time they really have to invest in however many people they're bringing on to their parent award. So, in terms of fairness, you want to make sure people are available to equitably and fairly contribute to your development and your growth as a diversity scholar.
Thank you very much to both for the answer.
That does raise one detail, that when you submit the supplements, the PI has to put themselves down for a time. So there's an expectation that the PI will be working with the person getting the supplement. And maybe Alexis, that was perhaps what the person was getting at, that they didn't have any available bandwidth. So I know Patricia has to leave in just a little bit here. So if anyone had any additional questions on the diversity supplement, well, the diversity or the reentry supplements before she has to take her leave of us, this would be a good time.
And I'm available by email. Happy to take phone calls if you have questions that come to you after we finish here today. This is just the beginning, not the end.
Great. I do see someone on the webinar who I believe is going to be receiving a K99 R00. And if I'm not mistaken, the R00 is on the list of qualified mechanisms that are eligible for a supplement, which might be a good way to hire an additional postdoc or a graduate student or an undergrad research assistant. Have you seen those from R00 applicants?
I have not seen many supplement applications from R00 applicants. Yeah, I think it is allowed for sure. but I have not seen many of those myself, but I'd be happy to talk about it down the road if there's a need. And so many of you may know we had a training officer who I think spoke for scientific review at the NIH. We will be having a new training officer starting in approximately the next 2 to 4 weeks. So they, will roll out their contact as soon as they start. But, anyone with training questions around any of the Ks or Fs or Ts are welcome to contact me. And I'll be involved even once this new training officer comes on board.
It does seem like that R00 mechanism is one of the few times that the PI would be very early career, and I wonder if that's why you don't receive as many applications from those folks.
It's possible. There's also more strict limits on the amount of time that R00 can last and things like that. So that could be a part of it, where some of the other mechanisms can be extended a little bit more and things like that. So that it may be for those reasons as well.
Does anyone else have any other questions? I am a big fan of ending things early and reclaiming some of our time when we can. We'll be sure to send out both Todd and Patricia's contact information for people, especially if you have any of those SBIR questions. I think you would definitely want to reach out to Todd, because that's an area that is difficult to, even more difficult than understanding the administrative and diversity supplements. But if no one has any additional questions, then I think we can end this webinar for today. And Jennifer, I don't know if you wanted to mention, or maybe Sarah, the kind of last part 3 of our grant support series. We have a deadline today, I believe.
Yep, we have a deadline today to do our second round of intensive proposal mentoring for folks. And so perhaps, I'm not sure when, Kathleen, the last time you sent out the announcement for participation.
I sent it last week.
Okay, so if anybody is still like somehow missed the opportunity to participate in this round, or didn't see that email, come and reach out to one of us and we can send that information to you again very quickly. But this is an opportunity to get feedback from some very senior folks in the network, and it has been really helpful to folks in the past. Jennifer, did you wanted to add any detail about that?
Nope, that was a great summary.
And as Patricia mentioned, the Butler-Williams opportunity is just opened up with an upcoming deadline, and that's another place to get really good, intensive grant mentoring. All right, well, thank you again so much.
Next week we'll send registration information for the February standard webinar. So keep an eye out on your inboxes for that.
Great. And I just want to thank again Eileen and Julie, Patricia in absence, and Todd for contributing to this panel. I think it was extremely informative to everyone who was here. So thank you again.
Thank you all.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bob, you're going to stick around?
Bye.